Thank you, and thank you for having me. I'm going to turn attention to the development of standards as they relate to external voting. And I want to talk in general about the extent to which there are actually standards that govern this, because obviously opening an external franchise interjects a number of political questions into any electoral process, and can also be subject to manipulation in very unique ways that are sort of technical that might undermine popular confidence in an election. And in the context of, particularly of transitional democracies in the OSCE region and in post-conflict situations, these sorts of questions might derail a broader process of democratic consolidation or post-conflict rebuilding. So I'm a little broader than just the EU. I'm looking at the OSCE region as a whole, and even a little bit more broadly than that, at the Council of Europe, because some components of the Council of Europe actually include countries that aren't even part of the OSCE region, but I'll come to that in just a minute. And the methodology that I'm working with is to look specifically at what standard-setting agencies have said about the external vote, where they are flagging recurrent problems, and what they're talking about in the context of rights-based questions, as well as in technical questions associated with the overall transparency of an election. So today I want to move very quickly through what are the origin and genesis of these election standards initiatives, where do we find them, what do they really mean, and then look at how they relate to external voting practices across the OSCE region, specifically with what I consider to be the core political or rights-based questions, which has to do with making sure that an external voting program is subject to the rule of law and basic criteria for governing an overall electoral framework. And then address the question on the scope of inclusion, which is really whether or not the OSCE region member states seem to be on a trajectory where it's going to become deemed an essential requirement or a state obligation to enfranchise those who are abroad. I'm going to argue that no, it is not at this point, and that's been fairly clearly articulated in a number of different institutions. But as Rainier suggested, the preponderance of evidence is we're all moving in this direction, and at some point customary practice sometimes tilts expectations in this regard. And then if I have time, we'll talk about the other sort of core rights-based question, which is if you're going to do an external voting program, what obligations are incumbent upon the state to ensure equality of access to that external voting program, both in the context of the equality of access for those external voters versus those who remain inside of the country, but also the equality of access between different categories of voters who are outside of the country based on the type of reason for why they left the country or where they happen to reside in the world. So with that said, just a couple of quick words on election standards. They have their origins in the major international human rights covenants. The key statement is found in the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, Article 25. I won't read that here. In the European context, the basic principle is rearticulated in Article 3 of the first protocol to the European Convention on Human Rights, which holds that the high contracting parties undertake to hold free elections at reasonable intervals by secret ballot under conditions which ensure the free expression of the opinion of the people in the choice of the legislature. There are a couple of other instruments that are important, treaty-based instruments that are important for understanding the expectations that are incumbent on OSCE region states, but they only pertain to a subset of OSCE region states. One is this interesting little document, the Convention on Standards of Democratic Elections, Electoral Rights, and Freedoms in the States Participants in the Commonwealth of Independent States. So as the title implies, it's primarily focused on the CIS members, and it actually has some very interesting things to say about external voting that goes significantly beyond any other major European-based treaty. In fact, it seems to entail an obligation for those member states to provide external voting rights. But it's a very little heard of instrument, and people in the standards world don't tend to talk about it much. Another important instrument is actually a global instrument, and that's the recently entered into force Migrant Rights Convention, which also puts direct obligations on states to enfranchise their migrants abroad, although it's a bit unclear on exactly how they're supposed to go about doing that, and the newly established Migrant Rights Committee is still wrestling with a couple of questions about what does that actually mean in terms of entailing a positive obligation. So that's where we identify the locus of the rules. When we talk about what constitutes a genuine election, what are election standards, they start with international human rights treaties. There is also monitoring and compliance of these treaties that helps us understand these rules in more detail. And in the European context, we're specifically talking about the European Court of Human Rights, and in deeper history, the European Commission on Human Rights, which got folded eventually into the court. And the court's been clarifying the scope of the political rights obligations embedded in the conventions and providing guidance to states on how to make them effective. The court has also had some interesting things to say about external voting, primarily in the context of building a case that it is not a fundamental requirement, at least as entailed in the European Convention, although there's a very recent case relevant to Greece that I'll talk about in a few minutes that maybe signals a shift in that regard. I want to distinguish the treaty-based instruments from the institutions and the intergovernmental initiatives aimed at election standards. And in particular, we're talking about two institutions, the OSCE and its subsidiary body, the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, ODIHR, which does two basic things. It does election observation across the OSCE region, and now we have this incredible history of election observation reports coming out of ODIHR running for over 20 years that we can look at and say, well, this is what ODIHR deems to be an acceptable standard on any given electoral-related issue. So I think it comprises a useful document to try to get a sense of where intergovernmental mechanisms and at least the staff at intergovernmental organizations think that an election standard might exist. And the other is the Council of Europe, particularly the work of the Venice Commission, which comments on national electoral codes in the context of human rights obligations of Council of Europe member states, and the Parliamentary Assembly, also of the Council of Europe. With that said, I wanted to talk about election standards in the context of the Copenhagen commitments that came out of the Copenhagen meeting of the Conference of Security and Cooperation in Europe before it got renamed the OSCE. Because the Copenhagen commitments to me seem to be the clearest articulation of the broader set of electoral standards. And I think you can take each of these and apply them to an external voting context and raise some interesting questions. And they have to do with the rule of law, the scope of inclusion, the scope of representation, as well as a range of the more technical issues that might be of more concern to an election administrator or an election management body than somebody that was trying to build a rights-based claim. The paper I'm working on organizes all of the external voting questions in accordance with the Copenhagen criteria because it sets benchmarks and commitments that the OSCE member states have undertaken in that regard. I'm going to look at the first three today because I always tend to run out of time, so I will try to stay within the time frame here. The first has to do with elections being governed by the rule of law. The basic principle from the standards initiatives seem to be suggesting that any electoral contest needs to be undertaken under the rubric of a clear and identifiable set of electoral rules that are negotiated well in advance of the electoral contest so that the political parties and political forces understand the rules of the game that they're operating in. In addition, the major features of the electoral system ought to be embedded in that particular context, including things like what type of system of representation will be used, how political parties can behave, whether or not there will be codes of conduct, all of these sorts of questions. In terms of the rule of law, there's no direct statements in any of the standard-setting agencies about how an external voting program ought to be structured or whether or not it ought to even be included in the context of discussions about the rule of law. However, if you look at the election observation reports, and we've looked at a lot of them now, a couple hundred of them, you find recurring statements coming out of ODIHR or out of the Venice Commission that are holding the case that external voting, when it's implemented in a last-minute or hasty fashion, raises deep political problems. And I'll just give one case here, and not to single a country out, but it's probably the most famous case, would have been the case of Croatia in the 1990s when they decided to enfranchise their external electorate. They did so in a way that provided overrepresentation to the external electorate compared to the in-country population. And they did so in a way that favored distinctly one particular subset of the external electorate, which was ethnic Croats resident in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And it was very clear that this last-minute series of electoral amendments that came just within 3 months of the election were designed to tilt the voting power to the ruling nationalist party. And they were strongly condemned by both the OSCE and by the Venice Commission for having done this. So these types of flagrant activities tend to be highlighted and tend to be found. The converse case would be the case of Armenia, which in 2007 is one of the only European states that ended external voting rights, as well as ended voting rights for dual nationals, no matter where they were residing, whether inside of Armenia or outside of Armenia. But again, instead of being critiqued as a consequence of having ended the external voting process, the Venice Commission specifically raised concerns that the laws were being amended in a last-minute way that were non-transparent, that were going to serve to benefit one of the sets of political forces within the country. So in terms of the general principles that we can extract by looking at what do standards say about elections conducted within the rule of law and how does that relate to external voting, it seems fairly clear that you want to deal with the core elements of the external voting system in the country's electoral code, that you need sufficient lead time for all the political forces to understand how does it affect competition in the country if you're going to open an external voting program. And it requires special scrutiny from election observers and monitors to understand what are the political implications at stake here in opening the external voting program. The second and deeper and probably core question has to do with the scope of inclusion, which is the debate about whether or not it's now an identifiable and fundamental human right to participate in your elections if you happen to be resident abroad. I think it's, on the one hand, the answer is easy. I mean, you can't really build this case, at least looking at the international human rights instruments, but I think there's been some interesting work that's come out of the OSCE and the Venice Commission in this particular regard. The general proposition that it's not a fundamental human right, your right to carry your vote with you when you travel outside of the country, is found actually in the language of the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights itself, which in Article 2 holds that each state party to the present covenant undertakes to respect and ensure to all individuals within its territory and subject to its jurisdiction the rights that are recognized by the present covenant. The Human Rights Committee has interpreted this language to hold that it's perfectly acceptable to establish residency requirements attached to the right to vote. And this has become the primary mechanism through which states limit in some way or eliminate altogether the ability of their expatriate nationals to vote, because they simply say you have to be resident in the constituency on election day or some date immediately prior to the election day if you're going to be cast that right. The significant exception to this basic proposition, I think one of the significant ones obviously has to do with the special case of refugees. And I'm not going to look at that as much today, but I believe there's a very strong international law case to be made that refugees, people who are outside of their home territory through no fault of their own, have a fundamental right to participate in their home state elections. There's both a human rights claim there, there's also a peace-building claim there, and I've published on that separately, but it's not going to be part of this particular project. The second would be the Migrant Rights Convention obligations, and there's 6 OSCE region states, Azerbaijan, Albania, Bosnia, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan, who have all ratified the Migrant Rights Convention. And that language is quite strong in the Migrant Rights Convention. So at some point, those states may find that rights-based claims are being made by their external and migrant populations. The third is the CIS Convention that I referenced earlier, which holds that every citizen living or staying in the period of conducting of the national elections beyond the boundaries of their state has the voting rights equal to those pertaining of other citizens of the state. Now, there's very weak institutional follow-up to this particular mechanism, and the OSCE and the Venice Commission have both looked at the CIS statement, and while they believe that it's a good and sort of adequate representation of overall electoral standards, it's not widely deemed to be an important source of rights vis-a-vis citizen populations vis-a-vis their home states. The European Court of Human Rights has repeatedly ruled that residency requirements are perfectly acceptable. The most recent case was Hilby versus Liechtenstein, which it said we have repeatedly ruled that residency requirements are acceptable and in no way infringe European rights vis-a-vis the European Convention. However, there was the very interesting case that came out earlier this year that actually stemmed from this building itself, from the European Parliament, and that was the case of, forgive my pronunciation, Sideropoulos and others versus Greece, where you had 2 Greek nationals who were working as staff members at the European Parliament who were unable to vote in Greek elections, and they sued Greece in front of the European Court. But they made a very particular claim that the Greek Constitution of 1975 had specifically said that Greece will, at some point in the future, provide voting rights to its expatriate nationals. And they made the seemingly reasonable claim that, you know, after all these years have passed since 1975, isn't it time for Greece to do something for us? And the court agreed. But the court did not agree in the context of saying it's now a universal right to the external franchise. Instead, the logic of the court's decision was that if countries are going to provide some sort of constitutional guarantee for truly universal suffrage beyond national boundaries, then there is a violation of the European Convention if they do not live in accordance with those particular obligations. Going forward, we'll see whether or not Greece is going to follow up on that ruling. They have other things on their agenda at the moment. Just to sum up, both the Council of Europe and the OSCE remain of the position that there is not a fundamental right in this regard, but both have observed the extraordinary growth in external voting. And both institutions have suggested, both in national commentary, but also in their general comments and standards, that we may be close to the point at which there is an expectation in this regard. And I'll stop there and won't cover the rest of it, but that's the